Blessings to everyone. Keep me in prayer. People say things and write things. Some of it is obviously derogatory and out to attack me because of my stands and things, and others laud me. And both are co-equally wrong. Don't put me on a pedestal. Put Jesus on a pedestal. Anything I have is only His grace working through me, but there's nothing special about me. I assure you, I'm just another brother, another guy like everybody else. Maybe by the grace of God, I have my virtues, but I certainly have my weaknesses. I struggle to carry my own cross like everybody, and there's absolutely nothing special or unique about me. I absolutely guarantee you, I'm not somebody worth putting on a pedestal. As Paul said, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. When I'm like Jesus, when I'm speaking from the word of Jesus, you can follow me because I'm following Him, but don't follow me. I want to follow Him, and you need to follow Him. Let's keep our eyes on Him. Now, this subject we're looking at, no Balm in Gilead, deals with the issue, what really takes place after the rapture? That is to say, what will transpire between the seventh seal being broken and the seventh vial being poured out before the millennial reign of Christ. That period between the rapture and resurrection and the millennial reign of Jesus, when He comes back, and as Tia pointed out from Isaiah chapter 9, the government will be upon His shoulder. That is a big period. What is happening during that period? Well, that period, as most of you know, is the period of the wrath of God. It is when the day of the Lord takes place. Now, this is too huge of a subject to obviously handle in any one meeting or one Bible study. We're going to look at one particular aspect today, okay? This idea of the day of the Lord. We have something that is you couldn't really call it a reductio absurdum, an absurd argument. It isn't. And you couldn't really call it something that is an enigma, although it is somewhat enigmatic. What am I speaking of? Look with me, please, to the end of 1 Corinthians, the end of 1 Corinthians. Verse 22, if anyone does not love the Lord, let him be accursed. Maranatha. Now, Paul switches from Greek to Aramaic there and uses the Aramaic term, not Hebrew, Aramaic, which is similar to Hebrew, but not Hebrew. Maranatha. He's speaking here a word that is the Hebrew dialect of Aramaic. Jews have always been like that. For instance, diasporic Jews, Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, have a Hebrewized dialect of German called Yiddish. Okay? Sephardic Jews, Spanish Jews, and Jews from Greece and Turkey, Jews from those countries, they have a Hebrewized Spanish called Ladino. So they mix Hebrew or impose Hebrewisms and certain Hebrew expressions and words and colloquialisms into another language, making a dialect of that other language. Yiddish is basically a dialect of German influenced by Hebrew. Ladino is a dialect of Spanish influenced by Hebrew, okay? Now, other cultures do this, but we're speaking about the Jews. Well, that's in the modern world. Ladino, Yiddish, okay. Orthodox Jews speak Yiddish as their main language. Ultra-Orthodox still speak it as their main language. Well, now other people have done this. The Amish have done it. They speak Pennsylvania Dutch. They impose certain English terms into the Dutch German language, and things like this. It goes back to the 17th century. Others have done this, and it's around. But Jews today, it's Yiddish and it's Ladino. Now I can kind of speak Yiddish, and I can speak Ladino because I know Spanish and Hebrew. So Ladino is pretty easy for me. But in the ancient world, the Jews had their own dialect of Chaldee, their own dialect of Chaldee. Chaldee being basically the language of Babylon, the language of the Babylonian captivity, which had been the lingua franca before Greek was. The Babylonians conquered most of the known world, and their language became the main language. When the Jews returned from the Babylonian captivity, they spoke Chaldee as their main language, but it mixed with Hebrew, much like German would later mix with Hebrew, or Spanish would mix with Hebrew. Then Chaldee mixed with Hebrew. Chaldee was of the same general family of languages as Hebrew, but it mixed with it. So what language would Jesus have spoken? Well, Jesus would have spoken this language. He would have spoken Aramaic, the Hebrewized Aramaic, a Hebrewized version of Chaldee. That's what he would have spoken as his main language. We know that because when he was hanging on the cross, he said he spoke in Aramaic. He didn't say in Hebrew, Eli, Eli. He said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. He spoke Aramaic. And other things, we know he said that the Greek text of the Gospels put the original language he was speaking, and it's Aramaic. Some people tried to say Jesus spoke Hebrew as his main language. All the evidence, historical, biblical, historical, and otherwise, shows that he spoke Hebrewized Chaldee. He spoke the Galilean variant of Aramaic, and it had a Syriac alphabet. The closest thing we have written to what Jesus would have spoke probably is something called the Peshitta text, the Peshitta text. Anyway, I digress. Paul switches from Greek, using the language of diasporic Jews, and he goes from the lingua franca, Greek, into Aramaic, Hebrew Aramaic. And he says, Mar Anata, Mar Anata. We just say Maranatha. In English, people say Maranatha. No, in the Hebrew, it's two words, Mar Anata. Mar is the Aramaic word for Lord or Sir. Now, it is also adopted into modern Hebrew to mean Mr. It's used as the term Mr. in modern Hebrew, but originally it was the Aramaic equivalent of Adon, Lord. Adon, Lord. Adonai, my Lord. Okay, Adonino, our Lord. So it's the Aramaic way of saying Lord. Lord, Mar Anata, come, Lord. Okay. The early Christians used this as a greeting. Colloquialism. Their hope and their focus was on the return of Jesus even then. Now, they expected he could come in their lifetime, that these prophecies would be fulfilled then. For instance, they thought that at one point Nero could be the Antichrist, that the events in 70 AD were going to fulfill the predictions of Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse. In fact, they fulfilled them partially, but not totally. Or the day of Pentecost, today being the day of Pentecost, Hag Shavuot. Peter quotes from the book of Joel, Joel chapter 2. And so it shall be in the last days, I will pour out my spirit. Only Joel says sun is not going to give its light, and the moon's not going to give its light, and the moon's going. No astral phenomena happened on the day of Pentecost. It was partially fulfilled then, but its total fulfillment is still to come. We talked about these things before. You had a partial fulfillment in the 1st century and 2nd century, but the total ultimate fulfillment is to happen with the return of Christ and the events leading up to and surrounding and following it. Okay. So this idea, Maranatha, was ambiguous. It had two aspects. One aspect was it was the general confession of Christians. Don't trust in this life or this world. Avinu Sheba Shamayim Yitkadesh Shimcha, our Father who art in heaven. Thy kingdom come. Tavo Malchutecha. Your kingdom come. The government will be upon his shoulder. Don't hope or trust in this life. Look to the return of the Messiah and the Messianic kingdom. So when they said Maranatha, they were confessing as a way of saying goodbye temporarily. They were confessing that they don't hope in this world, that they look to the return of Jesus. That's the way they looked at it. So they said, Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. We don't like this world. We know it's Satan's kingdom. It's not going to get any better. Ultimately, there's going to be an antichrist. It's in the power of the wicked one, but we thank you that you're coming back to destroy Satan and to restore the earth to what it was meant to be before man fell, the millennium.
Amen.
So when they said Maranatha, it was not just, I'll see you later, or goodbye, or whatever, or the hitraot in modern Hebrew. It was a confession of faith and an expression of hope. A confession of faith that he was coming back, and an expression of hope in its happening. Now remember, the word hope, epes, in Greek, does not mean, in its New Testament usage, I hope as in I wish. Hope in Scripture in the New Testament is future fact. It's future fact, okay? You have faith, pistes, and an elpis. You have faith, trust in a future fact. So when they used the term hope, they did not mean the way we would think of I hope in English, which means I wish. They were confessing their faith in a future fact. The Lord is coming. Maranatha. Okay. It was don't trust this life, trust in the kingdom of Messiah. And that was very much the philosophy that God gave man, gave Israel, even in the Old Testament, in the book of Ecclesiastes. God's philosophy of life is quite simple. It's the 12 chapters of Ecclesiastes. Make the best of a bad thing, but don't trust in it. Make the best of a bad thing, but don't trust in it. There's something better coming. This thing is not going to last. It's not even going to work. If you trust in it, you're going to be very disappointed. Trust in the coming of the Messiah's kingdom. So when they said Maranatha, that's the first thing they said. And they were expressing their faith or trust in a future fact, the return of Jesus and his kingdom that was going to replace, in their mind, the pagan Greco-Roman civilization and the Roman Empire, the imperial Roman Empire. It was going to replace that. And it was going to replace the Sanhedrin and so forth. Well, okay. But it had a second meaning. During times of persecution, and you had local persecutions throughout the first century, they tended to be local. Sometimes it would be unbelieving Jews persecuting believing Jews. Sometimes, as we see in the book of Acts and in church history, like with Justin Martyr, we see it was unbelieving Jews stirring up pagan Gentiles to attack Jewish believers and then to attack any believer. Okay. Sometimes it was the pagans doing it themselves. Great as Diana of Ephesus, you're going against our religion and our beliefs. They wanted to get rid of Alexander and Paul and these. Okay. Persecution tended to be here, there, everywhere. Under Nero, it began to intensify. But by the end of the first century, when the book of Revelation was written, it was the persecution of Domitian, the Emperor Domitian. Now, it was not just local. It was not just this persecution in Rome, or this persecution in Ephesus, or this persecution in Thessalonica. Now, there's persecution everywhere. Okay? And some places became really terrible, like Smyrna. So there was persecution everywhere, but in certain places, the persecution was worse than in other places. But ultimately, it was just terrible. Nero killed Peter and Paul. Horrible. Now, this is a picture of something that happens at the end of the age. There's always been persecution. But at the end of the age, it's going to be global. Once again, Jesus said, you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. All. Now, we know it seems to be worse in China, or it seems to be worse in Pakistan or in northern Nigeria. That is true. However, ultimately, with Antichrist, it'll be global. The things Christians suffer at the hands of Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, or that they suffer at the hands of Taliban in Central Asia, in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, or the things that they suffer in China under Ping. This is going to become global. Now, this is rising. But we go back to the first century, they were facing that. So the second meaning of Maranatha, Maranatha, spoke to their specific personal experience and circumstances. They were being persecuted by the emperors. They were being persecuted by the Sanhedrin. They were being persecuted by pagan worshippers of Diana of Ephesus, whatever. They were being rejected by family members who didn't believe. First among the Jews, and then Paul says the same thing was happening among the Greeks. Their families turned against them when they left the idolatry of Greek pantheism and polytheism. So, in their own circumstances, they're being persecuted. They want Jesus to come. Now they're not just saying Maranatha as a confession of faith in his return. Now they're saying it as, Lord, get us out of here. Before the rapture, this will happen again. Turn with me, please, to the book of Revelation, chapter 6. The fifth seal, verse 9. And when he broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained, like this sister in Nigeria, among many others. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord? Holy and true, wilt thou refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" And the Lord tells them, rest for a while. They're given a white robe until the number of your fellow servants and brethren who were to be killed, even as they'd been, should be completed also. Some people are destined for martyrs' crowns. It is not something to be sought. There was somebody who was a very misguided man who misguided others, but not with wrong motives, in the early church in the 2nd century, named Ignatius of Antioch. And he did a number of things that had ramifications that were very unfortunate. One of the mistakes he made, again, not with bad intention, but it was just wrong theologically, and in his practice, was he said martyrdom was to be desired. And there were cases where, as a testimony to the pagans, when Christians were thrown to the lions, the Shekinah would come on the Christians and the lions would be afraid of the Christians and wouldn't attack them. So he said, if the lions don't attack me, I'm going to attack the lions. I'm not going to be robbed of my martyr's crown. Now, this resembles the Islamic abomination of shahadi. Shahadi, the only guarantee of salvation in Islam, according to fundamentalist Muslims, is to die in jihad. That's why they don't mind being suicide bombers and things like this. They're going to get their 72 virgins and all of that stuff. Okay. Well, Jesus said, when they persecute you in this place, flee to the next. A time may come when it's God's purpose for you to be martyred. Jesus always evaded the crowds, didn't he? His father protected him. He evaded the crowds. They tried to throw him off a cliff. He got out of there and things like that in Nazareth. He always evaded those trying to persecute him until the time came where the Father wanted to give him over to atone for our sin. We are to be the same. Persecution and martyrdom are not things that we ought to seek. But we are to understand it will happen. And we are to understand why it will happen, why God allows it. And we are to understand what the outcome of it will be. Now, it is a very big subject in its own right. But at the end of the age, the time in which we live, heresy will become so widespread. Backsliding will become so common. Apostasy will become so widespread that the true church will not be identifiable from the apostate church. I just don't mean the Roman Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church or the World Council of Churches and liberal Protestants. I don't mean that. I mean like a supposedly conservative evangelical denomination like the Southern Baptists in America. The president of it, J.D. Greer, saying saved Christians should be the #1 spokesman for homosexual rights. Now, as their rights, they see the right to indoctrinate your children into homosexuality in schools at the taxpayer's expense. And the Southern Baptist president is saying we should be the #1 spokesman for their rights. This is apostasy. This is pure apostasy. I remember people, Elam and Assemblies of God in Great Britain, going into the counterfeit, laughing and drunken revivals. This is apostasy. When Elam was bringing in Morris Cirillo and these crooked money preachers from America, this is apostasy. Apostasy. apostasy becomes so widespread. I mean, among people professing to be born again, professing to be evangelical, that persecution becomes a necessary evil. The problem with persecution is it's those who don't need to be persecuted who get it first and worst. But it cleans out the dead wood. This caused a big issue in the early church called supralapsarianism. When people would would recant their faith in Jesus until the persecution was over and then want to come back into the church and things like this. The persecution cleaned out a lot of dead wood at the expense of killing a lot of good Christians. But only those who really believed and loved Jesus were willing to die for it. The others loved this world. The close of the age is going to be the same way. Jesus told the church in Smyrna, Satan will put you in prison 10 days. Fear not what you are about to suffer. Now, we've warned many times about the word faith money preachers. You don't have to suffer. You're a king's kid. Blab it and grab it. They forget what Jesus said about you're going to be hated and persecuted. They're just instruments of the devil, stopping Christians from being ready to face reality. But then there are other people who may not be financially motivated necessarily, but they're teaching we're going to be raptured out of here before we're persecuted. Tell that to the Christians in China or Nigeria or Iran or Saudi Arabia or to some of the countries I've been, including Saudi Arabia. It doesn't work that way. Again, they're being used by Satan to deceive the church. They're not out to deceive the church intentionally themselves. They are deceived. As Paul says, deceiving and being deceived. And people want to hear it. We forget about the Oxford martyrs. We forget about Ridley, Latimer, Hooper. We forget what happened to William Tyndale and to the followers of John Wycliffe. We forget in Great Britain, Christians were persecuted and murdered, brutally, burned alive. That's right. We have if you're reading the Bible in the English language, that cost Christians their lives to give it to you. Tyndale died, so you can have that book in the English language, William Tyndale. What a brother he was, and we shall meet him one day. And he's one of the guys I look forward to meeting too. Maranatha.
Praise God, brother.
Well, when you're in that situation, you say Maranatha. Persecution becomes a necessary evil. God has to allow it to clean out the dead wood. Jesus called it pruning. He's coming for a spotless bride, not the whore church we see today, following word faith money preachers, believing false doctrines, compromising with homosexuality, even denying the gospel. Most popular Christian book in the world after the Bible for 3 years straight, a decade ago, was The Shack, written by William B. Young, who denied that Jesus died for our sin in our place. And born-again believers were reading that book more than any other book except Scripture. And if they'd been reading Scripture, they wouldn't read his book. These deceivers, Satan has raised up, like Steve Chalk and people like this. God would be the quintessential cosmic child abuser if Jesus died in our place. They deny penal substitution. They deny propitiation. In other words, they deny the gospel and the real Jesus. And they say they're born again. This is apostasy. persecution becomes a necessary evil. The age of grace will come to an end during the final 7 years. You see these martyred saints in heaven offering imprecatory prayers. They're asking for God's judgment, the way David pled for God's judgment in the Psalms. Forgive them, Lord, and do. We've gone beyond that. Romans chapter 1 says God gives people over to homosexuality and to those who approve of it. Notice homosexuals are getting more and more and more militant against Christians. Now let's look at the world we live in. In Great Britain, a 69-year-old street preacher was attacked by a gang of lesbians and homosexuals. He got arrested and was prosecuted. The British government spent £2,500 to bring a witness to testify against him from Australia or New Zealand. Brother Harry. Other Christians have been arrested. Notice they don't arrest radical Muslim hate preachers. They don't arrest homosexual activists trying to force homosexuality onto children. No, they only arrest people who object to it, Christians. This is Great Britain. In Los Angeles, California last week, you had somebody claiming to be a girl, an adult, walking in a locker room facility with little girls who was not a girl. Christians protested. An Antifa gang violently attacked the Christians, beating them over the head with skateboards, threatening to kill them, and the police stood there and did nothing because they're politically pressured not to. This is the United States. Remember, listen to our recording, not even a minyan. The judgment of God on Sodom is going to come again. God gives these people over. This persecution is happening. But it builds up before the rapture. Now, the prayer of these saints, how long, Lord, will you delay? After that sixth seal, before the seventh, we see the saints have been removed to heaven. The rapture and resurrection have taken place. Then, lo and behold, something incredible happens. A silence in heaven briefly takes place in chapter 8, verse 1. After the rapture, the resurrection, they're going to know what happened. Everything goes quiet. You're going to be dumbfounded. And then the seventh seal is broken. Then the day of the Lord comes. Then the time of his wrath comes. Christians have persecution, but not wrath. Remember, tribulation comes from Satan. Wrath comes from God. The orge, the haronia in Hebrew, the orge in Greek. We are not appointed unto that. The faithful believers are removed. But once they are, his wrath comes. That seventh seal is broken. So, the question becomes then the following. On one hand, We are saying Mod Anata, Maranatha. But look with me, please, to Jeremiah chapter 17. The days of Jeremiah, the last days of Judah before the Babylonian captivity, teach what's going to happen to Israel and the Jews, and what is going to happen to the church or the Christians before Babylon the Great. One is a shadow of the other, a foreshadowing of the other. Jeremiah's day was Babylon. Revelation is Babylon the Great. And this day of disaster is coming. What is the prayer of Jeremiah? Let's begin in verse 15. Lord, they keep saying to me, where is the word of the Lord? Let it come now. Look, they mock. What did Peter say? Men will be mockers, saying, where is the promise of this? They're going to mock. They will mock the return of Jesus. And even now you have people denying and mocking the doctrine of the rapture. Rick Joyner and these people, Gerald Coates in England. They have the audacity to mockingly challenge God. Where is the word of the Lord? Let it come now. Before Jesus comes, the world and the apostate church are going to be doing that. Unbelieving Israel is going to be saying that to Jewish believers. The apostate church is going to be saying it to true believers. Jeremiah says in verse 16, but as for me, I've not hurried away from being a shepherd after thee. He was still trying to look after the sheep. Nor have I longed for the woeful day. He's saying, I didn't want the woeful day to come. I don't want it to come. Isn't this a problem? Look with me, please, to the book of Amos, chapter 8. I'm sorry, chapter 5. Verse 18 of Amos 5. Alas, you who are longing for the day of the Lord, for what purpose will the day of the Lord be to you? It'll be darkness and not light, as when a man flees from a lion and a bear meets him. Or goes home, leans his head against the wall, and a snake bites him. Snake being a figure of Satan, the seducer. Will not the day of the Lord be darkness instead of light, even gloom with no brightness in it? And then God talks about how I hate your religion. They have religion. At the close of the age, people will have religion, but they won't have Jesus. They'll be holding to a form of religion, but denying the power therein. You see this now with the books like The Shack? There's no power of salvation. He doesn't believe Jesus died in our place and took our sin. Oh, but I read that book and I was so blessed. No, you weren't. You were deceived, you silly person. Well, let's understand this. On one hand, don't seek the day of the Lord to come. On one hand, don't look for the woeful day. On the other hand, Mar Anatah. How do we explain this? How do we explain that Peter says to hasten his coming? We can hasten Jesus' coming. And Paul says, Maranatha, Maranatha, but we're not to long for that terrible day. But wait a minute. If the rapture heralds that day, shouldn't we long for that day? Because it's the rapture that inaugurates it. Once we're out of here, God's wrath comes down. How do we explain this? There are three ways we understand this apparent contradiction. Emphasize apparent. I'll put the third way first. The first way is this. The verses that say don't long for it are all in the Old Testament and have an application to the onset of the Babylonian captivity, even though they prefigure the events at the end of the age. That's the first way. Second, there's a difference between tribulation and wrath. The rapture has tribulation, but it saves us from wrath. Wrath is far, far worse than tribulation. Tribulation comes from the devil, wrath comes from God. The two are not to be confused. Jesus said you'll have tribulation in the world, but we are not appointed unto wrath. The pre-trib people make the mistake of conflating the two and treating them as one thing. Thalipsis and orge, as we've often said, are not synonyms. They're two different terms for two different things. The third way, however, is this. The scriptures speak of the travail of the church before the Lord comes, comparing it to pregnancy and childbirth. This is in Jeremiah, and it's certainly in Revelation chapter 12, which will be the subject of our next book, Born in a Manger, Coming on a Cloud. Think of a young Christian couple, they meet in church and they fall in love. And they get engaged. And they're looking forward to having a family. So they get married and they consummate their relationship and they marry in Christ with God's blessing. And all of a sudden, the wife is expecting a baby. There's a lot of joy and expectation from the first moment. And the grandparents-to-be get excited, and they take the spare bedroom and turn it into a nursery and put a baby wallpaper with images on it, and they buy a pram and a crib, and they get ready, and maybe they do ultrasound to see if it's a boy or a girl, to know whether they should have things in blue or pink or whatever they're going to do. And they're getting excited. But then there is morning sickness, vomiting, inexplicable craves that she never would have eaten otherwise. It's become almost a joke. But morning sickness is no joke. My wife used to get morning sickness at night. And with the growth of the baby and the embryonic sac, there's pressure on kidneys, very frequent urination, and it becomes more cumbersome. Eventually, though, you hear a fetal heartbeat on the fetal heart monitor, and you get an ultrasound picture. And then the parents-to-be are really excited. That's our baby, already exists. And we know things now that were not known in previous generations, one of which is unborn babies can recognize their parents' voices from the womb. And of course, this goes hand in hand with John the Baptist recognizing Jesus embryonically. It relates to that, but a baby can recognize its parents' voices from the womb. How could anybody say it's not human and justify murdering it? Now they're aborting them right up to the time of birth. And there's some people on postpartum abortions. If the baby survives an abortion, you can kill it. Now, this is, again, one of the things that happened before the Babylonian captivity under King Manasseh. And because of it, God's judgment had to come. Even when the people repented under Josiah, because of the blood of the babies, God said, judgment can tarry, can delay, but it must come. And now the Western world, including Britain and America, have reached the same point. Because of non-therapeutic abortion, judgment must come. You look at those people barbarically protesting the repeal of Roe v. Wade in America last month, which did not even repeal abortion. It simply says it's an issue for the voters to decide, not the courts. It's an issue for the elected representatives of the people to rule on, not unelected judges. That's all it said. It didn't stop a single abortion. But the drive, the demonically inspired drive to kill babies and calling it rights and, anyway, let's not go there. It's not our subject now. This Christian couple, though, has a joy. But as they get closer to the baby coming and the baby begins moving around and kicking around, right? If this couple has any sense, they're going to, well, now it's different. It's a problem now because yoga has contaminated it. But there used to be courses run by midwives who were mothers themselves. These were medically trained maternity nurses who had had babies themselves. And they would run these courses like for the expectant mothers who have not had a baby yet. And they had different methods, like the most famous one in America was called Le Mans, so I'm not sure about Britain. And they would do stretching exercises and breathing exercises. And they would show films of childbirth, and this is what to expect, and this is what's going to happen. And husbands would do the courses with the wives. Now, it was medically proven over a period of generations that these courses do help with maternal labor and managing contractions. They do help. But nothing is going to stop it except a cesarean section. You can do epidurals. You can do these Le Mans courses. Now, unfortunately, now they're using yoga. they're bringing this demonic stuff into it. It's not just stretching and breathing and things like that. But epidural can help, and episiotomy can help. Lamont can help. Those who know what's coming and prepare for it, it's going to be easier for the ones who never prepared for it. Well, that's like now. It says in Daniel, during this time, the faithful people of God, during the time of Antichrist manifestation and ascendancy, they will receive a little help. And epidural is a little help. Lamans is a little help. Episiotomy is a little help. All of these things help a little. However, in a pregnancy situation where labor goes on beyond 24 hours, the obstetricians become concerned about damage to the fetus, about a higher risk of oxygen deprivation at birth, of preeclampsia, internal bleeding with the mother. They take all of these other clinical considerations into account, and they say, we better opt for a cesarean section. We're not waiting for that kid to come out. We're going in and get it. The rapture is a cesarean section, as I've said before. The Greek word is kolobo. Kolobo. It's a medical term or a surgical term, and it's the same Greek word for amputation. The time of this suffering will be cut short. Remember, Jesus said that for the sake of you, it's going to be cut short. God's going to say, that's enough. I'm going in and get the man-child. However, although that young couple is expecting the baby and listening to the fetal heart monitor, and they're getting excited and looking at the ultrasound pictures and all that stuff and decorating and getting ready for the baby to come and buying baby clothes, and they're going to plan a baby shower and they're going to pick out a name for the baby and all these things that young couples would naturally go through with God's blessing, they still know there's going to be maternal labor, contractions. And they will know or have it explained to them by an obstetrician or by a midwife that there's things that can be done to help it. One is to psychologically be prepared for it, that it's coming. Don't think the kid's going to pop out of a toaster. Secondly, there are certain medical things. There are certain analgesics that can be given without going across the placenta and getting into the blood of the baby locally. Perhaps you can do certain things anesthetically. And of course, you can do procedures like episiotomy to prevent serious rippage, tissue rippage. And you can do things like epidurals and so forth. You can do things that help a little bit. They will receive a little help in Daniel. But you still know there's going to be labor. Now, you're excited about the baby. You're excited about the baby. But once the labor begins, so does this excruciating travail. And it is a part of the curse, the fall of man. And there's nothing you can do to help your wife but pray and encourage and do the stuff they taught you in the Le Mans course. Breathe, breathe, squeeze my hand, breathe, like all that stuff, push, push, all this stuff. What people do. Okay. The pain becomes so excruciating at certain points. You're not focused on the baby, you're focused on stopping the pain. But once that baby is born, the pain stops, and you hear that baby cry for the first time, clear out its lungs, and he's breathing, and the obstetrician presents that baby to the mother, and she holds it for the first time. That incredible love. All of the pain and anguish is instantly forgotten. The father is elated. Now it's different. Completely different. Yet there's no getting around the labor. Pre-trib people, as I've said before, are like a couple who think the baby's going to pop out of a toaster, who think a stork is going to bring it. It just doesn't work that way. And pastors not preparing their flocks for the realities are doing their congregants and themselves a great disservice. The Holy Spirit is showing more and more Christians the reality that pre-trib is an invention of John Nelson Darby. It's not in Scripture. It was not believed by the early church. And it's not what's going to happen. But the labor, the contractions are there. Now, the contractions in maternal labor can ease off for a while, but then you see that graph begins moving again. They come back with a greater ferocity. The last days, or I shouldn't say last day, the close of the age will be the same way. Persecution and pressure may ease off for interim periods, but then it comes back. There may be a respite. There may be a little help, but then it comes back. Once the rapture and resurrection take place, it'll all be forgotten and it'll all be more than worth it. Just think of women who've had multiple babies. Have you ever heard of a mother? I haven't. I suppose there could be some who said, maternal labor was so terrible, I don't want to have any more children. No, I know women. I even know unsaved women who have 3 or 4 children. I know Christian women who have 2, 3, 4 children. Sometimes some have more. The labor never stopped them from wanting to have another one, because they've been through it already. They know what it is, but they know the love and the joy of having the baby makes it easily worth it, even though the labor itself is real. We don't want the labor. We don't want the maternal contractions. We just accept their reality in order to get what we want. Now, the wrath of God is going to be much, much, much worse than the travail of the bride. Much worse. What is going to happen to the fallen world, to the kingdom of Antichrist, is going to be much worse than what happened to faithful believers. The wrath of God is going to be much, much, much worse than the tribulation of Satan. What Antichrist and the world does to the faithful believers is going to be moderate in contrast to what God is going to do to them. What Satan, Antichrist, and false prophet do to the faithful believers. And then they go after Israel after the rapture, but that's another subject. Also covered in the book. What they're going to do to us or to believers is nothing in comparison to what God is going to do to them. Well, that's a thought, isn't it? Look with me to the book of Daniel, please. No, we don't want the contractions. We don't long for the contractions. Oh, I just can't wait for the contractions. I can't wait for the pain. I can't wait for the agony. I can't wait. There's this enigma. I can't wait for the baby to come. I can't wait for the baby. Oh, I'm going to be so happy when the baby comes. I can't wait for the baby to come. You're saying that at the same time you're saying, I'm not looking forward to the contractions. Oh, I want Christ to come. But that's not the same as saying, because I know the Antichrist has to come before him, I want the Antichrist to come. Yes, Antichrist must come before Christ. But that doesn't mean we want him to come. It's an enigma. It's two things held in tension simultaneously. It's Maranatha, and it's be not anxious for the day of the Lord. It is, we want Christ to come, but we don't want the kingdom of Antichrist to come, even though the kingdom of Antichrist has to come and counterfeit the kingdom of Christ before the kingdom of Christ is. It's this tension. Well, let's look at Daniel chapter 7, please. Something I was reading last week. It's a chapter I read quite a bit. And in verse 21, I kept looking, and that horn, being the Antichrist, was waging war with the saints and overpowering them. Satan, through the person of Antichrist, is going to do a job on us, if he can. And he can. This goes on until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one. Forget about kingdom now theology and dominionism. Forget about the nonsense of the Restoration movement and the New Apostolic Reformation. and dominion theology, and we're going to conquer the world for Christ before he comes. Forget about Mike Bickle and the lies he preaches. Forget about the Calvinistic Reconstructionists. Forget about Rick Godwin. Forget about these people. That's not reality. This is reality. Jesus is not coming for a triumphant church that's conquered the world. He's coming with the triumphant church to conquer the world. But before this happens, look at verse 18. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. Verse 18, we're promised to get it. Co-reign with Christ. There's going to be persecution and opposition until he comes. But then he gives it and gives it to us. In between these two things, Satan has a field day through the Antichrist. Persecution of the faithful believers and the beginning of his war to exterminate Israel and the Jews. The way Hitler tried to, only he'll be a Hitler on steroids. Desperation. Yes, Satan has a field day during the reign of Antichrist. He has a field day. He gets everything. The media, the government, the financial system, the education system, close down churches, persecute Christians, growing anti-Semitism. He gets everything. He's having a field day. But he's not enjoying it. He's fighting for his own survival, knowing that God has said he is doomed. In other words, I think most of us who are watching what's happening in the world in light of Scripture can become very despondent about the way things are going. We know the Lord is coming in the long term, but in the short term, the medium term, the foreseeable term, things are not getting any better. We may get a little help. There may be interim periods of respite, but Satan's grip is getting tighter and tighter. He's controlling everything. Not just the media, not just the school systems and universities, not just the government, not just the financial system. He's controlling most of the so-called church. Look at it, they're ordaining homosexuals and lesbians. And Satan's in control of this. And if you're like me, you become frustrated. And if you become a Christian who experiences what the Christians are experiencing in China or Iran, or in Revelation 6, crying out from under the altar, the blood of the martyrs, you become angry. Angry. You're calling out to God for judgment. Romans tells you these people, the militant homosexuals, they've gone too far. The Lord has given them over to us. Very few of them are going to repent. Very few. Some may. Most won't. Just think of the days of Lot. Even after they were struck blind, they were still trying to tear the door down, so driven by an unnatural lust, that even after being struck blind, instead of worrying about their eyes, they wanted to be sexually gratified in a perverted and unnatural manner. That is the power, the demonic power on back of, there's a spirit on back of homosexuality, for sure. There's a spirit of murder on back of abortion, for sure. There's demonic powers on back of these evils. We have other tapes explaining it. One of which is the high priestly prayer. We explain it, but you can watch that on Moriel.org if you're so inclined. So we have this situation. Remember, as we go through this, as frustrating as it is, as aggravating as it is, the injustice, the American FBI being turned into a political Gestapo, putting Christian parents on terrorist watch lists because they're objecting to their children being taught homosexuality is normal. This is actually happening. Maranatha. Maranatha, come Jesus, put an end to this wickedness. I heard one woman saying, I thank the Republicans who are pro-abortion and pro-Roe versus Wade. Some of them are. She said, I'd sleep with one of them. I'd reward them sexually. She said this on TV. And if I got pregnant to celebrate, I would abort the baby. This is just...
That's pure evil, man.
Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. However, as frustrated and as angry and as despondent as I become, and I know other believers are the same, and some more so, the ones who are being persecuted, really, as despondent and as aggravated and frustrated as we are, reading Daniel 7, there's a comfort in knowing, there is a joy in knowing that Satan is even more miserable than we are. He knows his time is short. Yes, he's going around like a roaring lion, seeing whom he can devour. Why? Because he knows his time is short. He may be having a field day, but he's not enjoying it. You see, for us, the best is yet to come. For him and his followers, the worst is yet to come. Ultimately, we can only win. Ultimately, they can only lose. And so, in this circumstances, in my anger, in my frustration, and my despondency, I say, Maranatha. Maranatha. I say that. But I'm saying it because I know that, as Paul said, the trials and tribulations of this life and this world will be nothing. They will mean nothing in contrast to what's going to happen when Jesus returns and set up his kingdom. Now let's look at this. On the cross, being tortured in my place and in yours for our sin, we are told something in Hebrews. Jesus feels abandoned by his Father. Fellowship with his Father is severed temporarily because he takes our sin. He's being mocked. He's being rejected by his own people. He's being tortured by the Roman government at the behest of the religious leadership who claim to be the guardians of the Torah. In unspeakable physical, mental, and spiritual agony, cut off from his Father on the cross. He was despondent. Why have you forsaken me? But what else does it say? He did it for our sake, certainly. But what got him through it? What does it say got Jesus through it? His Father didn't help him. His Father did not help him on that cross. The wrath of God was poured out on Jesus in our place. He suffered the wrath of God so we wouldn't have to. His Father wouldn't help him or see him through it. His own Father wouldn't help him. What got him through it? How did he do it? Not that he had much choice, but what saw him through it? We are told in Hebrews, he considered the joy set before him. What gets a mother in labor through the contractions? He considers the joy set before her. I know a lot of women who've had babies, Christian women, mothers, wives, and they're glad they did. They don't remember the labor. They know what happened, but they wouldn't say, I'd give up this baby in order to not have that happen to me. No, they consider the joy set before them. The faithful church will consider the joy set before her. The faithful Christian will look on Jesus and, like he did, consider the joy set before us. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless.